Loma Linda University is a unique place because of the integration of faith and healthcare.
We are located in Southern California, and we are one of only 2 faith-based academic medical complexes in the nation, where our mission is to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ.
Loma Linda University has been an innovator in medical research by pioneering proton cancer treatment and infant heart transplant. And our Level 1 Trauma Center will continue to advance quality healthcare and education with our new adult and children's hospital.
As an academic medical complex, our 8 schools are all located on the same campus as our medical center. This provides distinct opportunities for interdisciplinary work with students from all of our programs.
The professors are what really makes Loma Linda special. They truly care about my success, not only academically, but also spiritually and personally.
And because of the smaller class sizes, I really feel like I get personalized attention from the professors.
I really enjoy the lifestyle promoted here at LU. They encourage us to live a balanced life of diet, exercise, social activities, and spiritual life. This is where our motto, "To make man whole," comes from.
I love exercising at the Wellness Center. They provide opportunities to distress and relax with friends through intramurals and exercise.
And since we're only 1 hour from the beach and 1 hour from the mountains, there are all kinds of opportunities for amazing weekend adventures.
I also like the opportunity to travel abroad and share what I've learned with those in need. And even here in our own community, there are many ways to get involved with outreach.
Because of Loma Linda's emphasis in mission and outreach, I truly believe that my career is making a difference in the world.
Loma Linda is a unique place. It's where we care more about who you are than what you know. We take this opportunity to combine faith and healthcare training to produce unique professionals.
Good evening. My name is Michael Samardzija, and I serve as the Vice President for Research Affairs at Loma Linda University Health. I'm honored to be speaking to you, albeit in this unusual remote manner. I hope that you and your loved ones are safe and healthy. Our mission at Loma Linda University Health is to continue the teaching and healing ministry of Jesus Christ. To that end, today's presentation will focus on the results of 3 of our researchers regarding health. It is considered poor practice to define a word as an absence of something. For example, we wouldn't define love only as the absence of anger, or anger only as the absence of love. Yet in the medical community, there is a propensity to define health as the absence of disease. In reality, health is a spectrum of which the presence of disease only tells half the picture. Today's presenters will speak of how lifestyle and diet can play crucial roles in health and in the absence of disease. You will first hear from Dr. Gary Frazier, a distinguished professor in preventive medicine and medicine, both in the School of Medicine, a distinguished professor in the School of Public Health, and director of the Adventist Health Study. The Adventist Health Study began in 2002 and has tracked over 96,000 Seventh-day Adventists across the United States and Canada. The study includes 26,000 African Americans and immigrants from the Caribbean. The chief goal was to examine the relationship between diet and cancer, and thus the study was funded largely in part by the National Cancer Institute. Results from the study have been shared in over 600 peer-reviewed publications. Dr. Frazier will share some of the key findings from this study. You will also hear from Dr. Joan Sabate, a professor at the School of Public Health and at the School of Medicine. He is also the executive director for the Center for Nutrition and Lifestyle and Disease Prevention. Throughout his career, Dr. Sabate has looked at the effect of various foods on health. His work in the early 1990s demonstrated the health benefits of walnuts for cardiovascular health. Prior to his publication, doctors were advising patients with cardiovascular issues to refrain from eating fatty foods, including nuts. Dr. Sabate's work changed this perspective. You will also hear from Dr. Olivia Moses, an assistant professor at the School of Public Health and at the School of Medicine. Dr. Moses is also the director of our Wholeness Institute, and she also serves as the head of Loma Linda University Health's corporate wellness program. She will provide evidence of the need to develop such programs and their actual benefits in maintaining health and curtailing disease. In between these presentations, you will see short video clips of some of our other research programs here at Loma Linda University Health. And our president and CEO, Dr. Richard Hard, will say a few words regarding our motto, to make man whole. At the conclusion, our presenters will be on hand to answer any of your questions. And now, I turn the floor over to Dr. Gary Frazier.
At age 100, Benita Williber still has a healthy mind, body, and spirit.
I've given myself to the Lord, and I've left myself in His hands, and I have trust, and I have been very, very well taken care of.
She's not alone. There's an unusually high concentration of centenarians in her hometown of Loma Linda, California. It's one of only 5 so-called blue zones worldwide, areas where people live the longest. The others are Okinawa, Japan, Korea, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, and Nicoya, Costa Rica. Loma Linda is an hour east of Los Angeles. About 250,000 people live here. The reason they're so healthy is because most of them are Seventh-day Adventists. On average, they live 10 years longer than most Americans. Dr. Larry Beeson has researched this phenomenon for the last 50 years.
Adventists have approximately the same proportion of people who die of cancer, heart disease, or stroke, but the age that they get diagnosed is much later.
They strongly adhere to the belief of respecting the human body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. That means no alcohol, no tobacco, and following a plant-based diet.
In Christianity, we have the Holy Scriptures. What God said from the beginning, you should eat. He gave us the nuts and the grains and the herbs that He placed in the earth. And He said, you will do better if you subsist on that type of thing.
What has your diet been throughout your life?
Vegetables. My sister liked fruit. Well, I do too, but vegetables had priority, and I like them raw.
Many Adventists, like Benita, are total vegetarians. Others will eat a little dairy, while some occasionally consume fish, and there are those who eat small amounts of poultry and beef. These choices lead to different health outcomes.
The more flesh foods you eat, the more Alzheimer's, the more heart disease, the more cancer, the earlier the death occurs. We're going the other direction as people move toward the removing flesh food from the diet. There tends to be a delay in the onset of the diseases.
Diet isn't the only factor in these longer lives. Seventh-day Adventists strictly observe the Sabbath. Every Saturday, they rest to recuperate from the week and recharge for the one ahead. Also, to spend time with friends, family, and God. Stuart Hardy, who pastors one of the world's largest congregations, says resting on the Sabbath includes abstaining from electronics.
Any of those things that kind of take you back into work We try and avoid those things. Now, it's not like it's a rule, but when you think about it, if there's anything that you're involved in during the week, if you go back to that, then you're not really taking a break from it.
I feel that rest is one of the most important things in aging. That if you rest, then you can get up and gallop.
Medical research confirms stress kills.
Science has always kind of had some kind of tension with religion, particularly in contemporary society. So it's great to be able to read something in the scriptures that suggests what we should do, and then science is not only affirming it, but even giving us more specific understanding of why it benefits us so much.
Exercise is also a priority. Throughout her life, Benita was extremely active. Now she walks every day, but admits she doesn't have the strength she once did.
It is subsiding, and that's the way God had intended for people to be, and so I accept that too, even though I don't like it.
Adventists are able to stick to their healthy lifestyle because they're surrounded by others living the same way.
My mother used to keep us in the straight and narrow way by saying, now be careful with the company you keep. Because if you keep a certain company, strange enough, it has an influence upon you.
So look to the Seventh-day Adventists who live an average of 10 years longer than the rest of us. They exercise and observe the Sabbath. They avoid alcohol, tobacco, and meat, all within a social network that reinforces that behavior. Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Good evening. My name is Gary Fraser, and greetings from Southern California. It's indeed a pleasure to be able to talk to you so far away and talk about the studies that have been going on here at Loma Linda now for 50 or 60 years, focusing really largely on diet and risk of chronic disease. And we've had about 6 decades of exciting discovery, as I've mentioned here. This has encompassed a number of large epidemiologic prospective studies. First of all, the Adventist mortality study, which began way back in 1958. Then what we call Adventist Health Study 1, that I will talk a little bit about, but mainly I'll be discussing Adventist Health Study 2, which began in 2002. Pretty much up to the present time. And this has all resulted in about 350 publications in the peer-reviewed literature about the health of Adventists. So this has been a story of scientific discovery. And as we all know, science is a matter of progression of understanding, and a little bit forward, a little bit backwards. There are a few absolutes in science. And we often begin with an idea which seems reasonable or something which has occurred to us in the minute, and we build a story around that, looking at the evidence that either enhances or reduces the credibility of that story. Well, Adventists have had a long story since their inception about 150 years ago, the idea being that a plant-based diet was more healthful. And this wasn't a unique idea back in the 19th century, but the Adventists took it and ran with it in a fairly powerful way. And in fact, the idea that a plant-based diet may be more healthful did have a certain appeal even in scientific circles by the mid-1950s. This was based on the comparisons of disease events in different populations in the world that ate more or less of these different foods, an increased understanding of the pathology, particularly of atherosclerotic disease, and to some extent cancer. And so some somewhat credible story of mechanisms favoring a plant-based diet could be put together. So why would we study a population of Adventists? Why have we had about $30 million from the National Institutes of Health and other funding agencies here in the United States? Well, there are certain advantages in studying a population like this. First of all, there's virtually no smoking and relatively little use of alcohol. And these are kind of confounding factors that confuse the situation sometimes when you're looking at diet. Adventists, in fact, include a wide spectrum of dietary habits. One of the big advantages for an epidemiologist is that not all Adventists are vegetarian. And there are thin Adventists and fat Adventists and those that exercise and those that don't and so on. There is even those that eat hamburgers frequently and those that don't. So this gives us a wide spectrum of dietary habits that includes a lot of people who actually eat fairly traditionally, but also those that have mildly atypical choices. And it's partly this atypical dietary character that's an advantage for innovative dietary exploration. So AHS2, actually, Adventist Health Study 2, is the largest study of vegetarians and vegans in the world, including about 96,000 Adventists from all over the United States and some from Canada. And about 26,000 of these actually are African Americans. In a number of the reports that I'm going to focus on, you'll see that we've divided the vegetarians into different kinds of vegetarians. But they're not all the same. There are the vegans who eat no animal products at all. There are the lacto-ovos who will eat dairy and eggs, although it turns out only about 60% to the extent that our non-vegetarian Adventists will eat dairy and eggs. Then there are pesco-vegetarians who eat fish but no other flesh foods, and non-vegetarians who are nearly half of our population who eat flesh foods, not only fish, other flesh foods, at least once a week. But as we'll see later, even these non-vegetarian Adventists tend to be relatively low meat on average. And you can see there in the second column here that here are the relative percentages in our study of these different kinds of dietary patterns. That 8% vegan, most of our vegetarians are the lacto-ovo variety, about 10% are the pescos, and nearly half are non-vegetarians. I'm going to come back and talk to you about several different kinds of clinical endpoints. Overweight, cardiovascular disease, risk factors, heart disease, cancer, life expectancy, and then a little bit about mechanisms right at the end. So first of all, let's think about overweight, which of course is a big epidemic all around the world. And I know even in India that metabolic syndrome is, particularly in southern India, is a particular problem. And where we look at our different kinds of vegetarians, with the vegans being the green, up through to the non-vegetarians, these are the lactose, pescos, semi-vegetarians, and the non-vegetarians, you can see that the body weight for an average height female just goes up like a step ladder. Similarly, for an average height male, we see the same situation. And this is not unique to our data. Even studies of vegetarians in the UK find the same thing. It makes a big difference to body weight, your dietary pattern. Without going to a lot of detail here, I can tell you that the dietary factor in our data that most strongly predicts higher body weights is consumption of meats. And it doesn't matter whether it's red meat or white meats. This is after having adjusted for fiber. And the dietary factor that most best predicts lower body weights is actually dietary fiber. And most of you will know that dietary fiber is found only in plants. So this brings up the idea of a plant-based diet. And we can then understand that vegetarians have a double advantage. What they don't eat is important, but also what they do eat is important. And we need to remember that. This is a paper that we published 4 years or so back, which is interesting, again, relating to overweight and body weight, and looking not so much at what you eat, but how you eat it, what timing during the day. And here you can see at the top left, a little complicated, that these are the number of snacks during the day. And this is over a period of about a decade, how much weight you tend to put on during that period. And you can see that there's a steady rise in the rate of putting weight on during those period of a few years, if you have more meals and snacks in the day. The length of the nighttime fast, in other words, the time from your last meal in the day to your breakfast the next morning, also turns out to be important. And again, you can see that the longer that nighttime fast, the less likelihood of you putting on weight. Whether you consume breakfast, the breakfast consumers have an advantage. And the timing of the largest meal, those who have the largest meal as dinner have the greatest possibility of putting on weight. And so when you look at this data actually and work it out, and you probably have hardly time to look at this, it turns out that we're talking about here 4 or 5 pounds in difference per age decade. And you might say, well, that's not terribly much. But it turns out that's about the rate that many will gain weight as they age. And you accumulate that over a few decades, and you can immediately see that we're actually talking about something quite important here that can be impacted by simply the way that we choose to eat. I'd like to turn now to cardiovascular disease risk factors that we're all very familiar with, and look at how our vegetarian dietary patterns seem to impact those. These are looking now at self-reported blood pressure levels, or whether they're on treatment for high blood pressure actually. And you can see that as compared to the vegans, the non-vegetarians have a much greater likelihood of being treated for high blood pressure. If we look at those that are being treated for diabetes, diabetes 2, we see again goes up like a step ladder across these dietary patterns. Whether they're on statins or other treatment for blood cholesterol, the same thing. And you might say, well, this is people who report that. What about if you actually measure blood pressures or measure cholesterols? And I'll show you in a moment that the same kind of patterns come through. Another risk factor, which has become somewhat well known, is C-reactive protein, a measure of inflammation. And again, we find this same increase in values of CRP between the vegans and the non-vegetarians. No surprise, perhaps, that the fasting insulin levels also follow the same pattern, given what we saw for diabetes and body weight and things of this sort. And as I did mention, that if we look at measured blood pressures, measured LDL cholesterol, and also a composite of these variables that make up the metabolic syndrome, we also find this increasing prevalence in the non-vegetarian Adventists. These are all Adventists, remember. They're all non-smokers and virtually non-drinkers and so forth, but they have a different dietary habit. And so it seems like in these regards, the Adventist vegetarians are nearly always doing better than the Adventist non-vegetarians. And so cardiovascular risk factors seem to definitely be responsive to diet. So that raises the question, that's risk factors. What about heart attacks between the average Adventist and, say, the average non-Adventist in California? This is going back to our Adventist Health Study 1, which was only in California, about 34,000 Adventists. And we were comparing to statewide data for the non-Adventists in California. And here we see that we've given 1.0 the risk across different ages here of heart attack in the non-Adventist comparison group. At these different ages for men and women Adventists at the same period of time using the same diagnostic criteria, here we find a much, much lower rate, particularly in the younger people, a little less pronounced as the Adventists got older. And so this raises something that we see time and again, particularly for cardiovascular disease, but also for all-cause mortality. It seems to be premature events that the way we live is to some extent helping us avoid in the Adventists. So looking at, digging a little deeper now beyond the dietary patterns, to look at even some of the things that we eat. And again, what I've just shown you in this comparison between Adventists and non-Adventists in California was putting all the Adventists together. Well, it's an obvious thing that we should pull out the vegetarians as compared to the others and see how they compare to the non-Adventists. And we see that when we look at the vegetarians, their relative risk is even much less than putting all of the Adventists together. This for the fatal events, this for the definite myocardial infarction. Not so clear on the woman perhaps out here, although the confidence intervals are very wide, as we had relatively few women with a definite myocardial infarction. But it looks like, again, the vegetarians are doing better. And this now turns to our more recent study, Adventist Health Study 2, based on 372 coronary heart disease deaths. So we're looking only at mortality now from heart disease. And we see again that put both sexes together and the vegetarians are doing better in the yellow bars. This was particularly true for men, little less convincing for women. And we need to remember here that our Adventist non-vegetarians are themselves a pretty healthy group. And these were our comparison group. In this study, Adventist Health Study 2, I'm not comparing to the non-Adventists again, I'm comparing to the non-vegetarian Adventists. So in this slide, again, we're back to all being Adventists. And so the orange group, our reference that we gave a score of 1, are pretty healthy people, relatively low meat consumers, but our vegetarian Adventists are still doing noticeably better. As I mentioned, let's dig a little deeper, look at a couple of particular foods. We reported this back in the 1990s and raised a fair bit of controversy that we found that amongst our Adventists, those that ate more nuts, and the men here and the women here had lower risk of definite coronary heart disease events. And this was highly significant, as you can see. And this was adjusted for a whole bunch of other things. So this was interesting. And nuts are fatty foods, but they tend to have unsaturated fats. Walnuts polyunsaturated. And we actually cut the population in about 18 different ways and looked at nut consumers amongst those that were heavy and those that were not, and those who ate fish and those that didn't, and so on. And we nearly always found the pattern. So here amongst even the vegetarians who ate more nuts, they had a lower risk. And the same was true for the non-vegetarians and so on. And many of you will know that since that time, this was the first report, a number of other large studies have reported the same thing. So it looks like part of the signal that we're seeing for vegetarians is perhaps related to nut consumption. And here, a more recent paper, we've looked at the apparent impact of nut proteins on risk of cardiovascular disease mortality, even after adjusting for dietary fats. And again, we see this interesting pattern for events in younger people. Those that have higher levels of nut protein intake have distinctly lower risk. And for those in middle age, the same thing. But for those in more advanced age and even the very old, the pattern essentially disappears. So again, we seem to be talking about premature events. Another factor that, of course, is pretty well known is that relating to red meats and meat protein. And again, after adjusting for dietary fats, this was a paper about protein, as you might have gathered. But again, we see an apparent impact, this time in the opposite direction, increasing risk of more meat protein. But again, that signal tends to die away in the very elderly. So that's what I want to say in the few minutes I have relating to heart disease. Let's turn the coin over now and think about some of the common cancers. First of all, comparing Adventists to non-Adventists. So one can take these at different kind of layers in a way, looking at broad patterns, Adventists compared to non-Adventists, then comparing different kinds of Adventists, and then you can look at broad dietary patterns, and you can look at particular foods. And later we'll go on to look at even metabolites in the blood. So there are many ways to examine some of these questions. Well, this was a study we published a couple of years ago that using our recent AHS2 study, which is a national study of Adventists, remember about 96,000, we could then compare the rates of different cancers to similar rates from a US census population, another study that used the census basis, but also combined that with data from a number of the statewide cancer registries in the US to give cancer statistics. And we did the same thing. We worked with the cancer registries in different states across the country. And so we can see here, looking at all cancers, if we give the census population a risk score of 1, we can see the Adventists have about a 30% protection, highly significant. Even the Black Adventists, as compared to non-Adventist census Blacks, there was about a 22% reduction. And if we look at these different cancers, they move around a little because the numbers get smaller when you dig them and become more specific, and particularly amongst the Blacks, which was a subgroup, about a quarter of our population. The confidence intervals get wider, but you could see in general, without going into a lot of detail here, that these black spots are typically hanging to the left of this 1.0 line. So overall, the Adventists are tending to do better. This was adjusting for smoking, past smoking habits. We actually excluded non-smokers from this whole analysis. So our census population were non-smoking, non-Adventists, also adjusting for education and also for different regions that these people lived across the country. So quite strong evidence, I think, that something important is going on here. So let's dig a little deeper and say, well, what could it be about the Adventists that's giving them this advantage? And we focus on diet and looking at the 3 common cancers in the United States, which are colorectal, prostate, and breast. Here we look at colon cancer, and this is the risk of surviving free of colon cancer. So that's a negative risk, if you like. And you can see here that the risk of surviving free of colon cancer is greater, so this is advantageous, in this group out here. And these are the vegetarian Adventists, and this is the risk of remaining free of colon cancer as age advances amongst the non-vegetarian Adventists. And this was unlikely to be due to chance, p-value 0.013. If we look at incident prostate cancer, a little different way of looking at it, just taking relative risks. Again, these are all Adventists, so we're giving the 1.0 a score, actually in this case for the non-vegetarians, and you can see here that they get that score of 1.0. The pesco-vegetarians, really no different. See the confidence interval here. The lacto-ovo-vegetarians, really no difference. The confidence interval easily encompasses the 1.0, but it's the vegans that seem to be getting an advantage with respect to prostate cancer, about a 34% reduction, and this was highly statistically significant. So let's keep that in mind. Thinking about breast cancer now, again, we're doing this a little different. We've actually looked at all 4 or so of the different dietary patterns, and again, these are all Adventists. The blue for the C are the pescos, the red are the non-vegetarians, and the yellow for dairy are the lacto-vegetarians, and as you might guess, the green are the vegans for their vegetables. And again, it seems to be the vegans that are hanging out as different compared to our reference group, which is the red non-vegetarians. And this didn't quite achieve statistical significance, but you'd have to say it looks interesting, doesn't it? That they seem to be having a better experience of staying free of breast cancer as they get older. So let's keep that in mind as well. So we're finding for prostate and breast that the vegans are doing better, and the lactose, nothing much going on. For colon cancer, we're actually finding that all the vegetarians are doing better than the non-vegetarians. So that might lead us to think about particular foods that could be involved here. What's characteristic of the vegans? Many things actually, but even in the definition, the absence of dairy is one defining characteristic, isn't it? Now they had more fruits and more vegetables and more nuts and other things, so we need to bear that in mind. But and then of course the red meats are a particular difference comparing vegetarians as a whole to the non-vegetarian Adventists. So here we're looking at processed red meat. This is actually unpublished data as yet. It's kind of interesting. And many of you will be aware that the World Health Organization and other august bodies have decided that it's pretty conclusive that processed red meat, in fact, red meat as a whole, is a risk factor for colorectal cancer. And so we decided to look at that. We had relatively few Adventists that ate a lot of processed red meat. So our power to look at this was not great, but it was interesting. And about 50 grams a day of processed red meat is about one sausage a day. We didn't have a lot of Adventists that were doing that, but we had some. And when we looked at the risk of colorectal cancer, these spots, we've kind of divided the people into categories of processed red meat consumption, with kind of roughly equal numbers in each category. You can see that the risk goes up in a pretty spectacular way. Now, the confidence bands are quite wide here, but they do exclude the null of 1.0, so something is going on. And it's interesting that the WHO recommendations and results from a number of studies suggested that there was about a 16–18% risk at the 50 grams per day increased risk of colorectal cancer. We're finding about a 50% increased risk as our best guess, although our confidence in that is there's a fair bit of flexibility in that estimate, but we do seem to be finding greater risk. Looking at now dairy with respect to colon cancer, again, we find interesting results. If we look at those that are at the highest quintile of dairy consumption, averaging about 370 grams a day, as compared to our lowest group, and because we have a bunch of vegans, you know, and even some of our other vegetarians don't consume much dairy, we can have as a reference the zero group. We find that those that are consuming more dairy have about a 1/3 reduction in colon cancer, borderline statistical significance. If we say, well, could that be due to the calcium in the dairy? So let's look at total calcium, not just dairy calcium, but total calcium in the diet. And again, comparing the highest quintile to the lowest quintile of calcium intakes, we find about a 50% reduction in risk. So in our data, dairy appears to be associated with a lower risk of colorectal cancer, but our analysis raises the question of whether it could be due to the calcium content of the dairy. And as many of you will know, we are not unusual in this. There are a number of good prospective studies who have all raised a question mark over dairy. Others have not. So this is not considered a convincing risk factor, but there are questions. And our data appears to be in line with that of other studies. So dairy may be associated with protection for this cancer and perhaps related to calcium content. Well, we find that when we look at another common cancer, breast cancer, the situation seems to be totally different. And our data is a little bit out on a limb here, but I would say it's fairly strong. And notice this is on a log scale. So we've only got to 1 cup of milk. This is milk, dairy milk a day here, and here is up to 4 cups, and this is only 1/4 cup. And you can see here that this is adjusting for a whole bunch of factors, reproductive factors, and whether they breastfed children and so forth amongst the Adventist women, that there is a strong and significant relationship between consumption of dairy milk and risk of breast cancer. And because of the log scale, it actually turns out that if you unlogged it, there's a rapid rise in risk up to about 1 cup a day, and thereafter the slope gradually dissipates, which is interesting. And we've looked at the fit of the model for those of you who are statisticians, and it's a very good fit using restricted cubic splines. When we look at prostate cancer, interestingly, we find exactly the same thing. And again, there's a number of studies that support this and some that don't. And here, this is not on the log scale, this is back transformed. And so you can see this rapid rise in risk up to about a cup a day, and thereafter it tends to flatten. And so our data is in support of a number of other studies that seem to be showing some increased risk for prostate cancer with dairy consumption. Notice, by the way, that for both the breast and the prostate, when we looked at cheese and yogurt, we did not find a significant signal. Most of the signals seem to be coming from dairy milk, which is interesting. So putting it all together quickly here, for bowel cancer, the vegetarian Adventists as a group did better than the non-vegetarians, and so you could make the case that this is probably substantially related to the absence of red meat, perhaps processed red meat. I didn't show you this, but when we looked at the vegans and the lactose and the pesco separately, the vegans didn't do quite as well as the lactose and pescos, although they were doing better than the non-vegetarian Adventists. And we wondered if this was due to the absence of dairy and the lower calcium consumption of the vegans as compared to the other vegetarians. In breast cancer, it was the vegans only that did quite a lot better than other vegetarians, apparently in our data, and we might wonder now about the absence of milk as part of the reason for that. And exactly the same thing we saw for prostate cancer, the vegans only. So we could put together the diet patterns and a couple of these foods that we looked at into a package that does make some sense. I'd like to turn now from cancer to another one of our clinical endpoints, that being of life expectancy or the risk of dying from any cause, starting off between average Adventists and non-Adventists. So the first work we did looking at this was from our study HS1 that, remember, was just in California. And again, we could look with a large number of deaths, about 7,000 deaths, in the Adventist group, and compare that to statewide statistics. And rather to our shock, actually, we found that the Californian Adventist men were living 7.3 years longer than the California non-Adventist men. And the woman, the same was true, but the difference was about 4.5 years. If we looked only at the vegetarian Adventists, we found that these numbers went up to about 9 years and 6 years. So these were really impressive and very, very highly significant, not likely to be due to chance. Looking at the data in a slightly different way, we could say, well, what about the percent of people who survived to age 85 years, for instance? And in the United States, for men, it's about 20%. For women, it's about double that, 40%. This was data from the late 1980s. In the Californian Adventist men, it was double that, about twice, nearly 40% were surviving to the age of 85. And if you go to the vegetarian men, Adventist men, it was nearly half. And if you look at the woman, remember it was 40% non-Adventists, about 55% of the Adventist woman, and the vegetarians about 60%. So again, big differences that were consistent with what we just showed you. So that was HS1 in California. We've recently taken the opportunity to look now at our national data, and remember to compare it to a census population mortality data. So again, very, very large numbers of deaths. And we gave the US Census population, the non-Adventist, a score of 1. And here we see the Adventists as a whole have an advantage of about nearly 35%. And look at the confidence bands, 95%, they're very narrow. And at age 85, a little bit less of an advantage. Remember that premature death reduction we talked about, but still very impressive. If we look at the Black Adventists compared to national Blacks, again, a very similar result. And then we thought, well, what about major causes of death? And we looked at cancer, and there is an advantage there, but it's only about 10%, not as much, but it is there. And amongst the Blacks, a little better. Other causes of death, which is interesting, and these are cardiovascular, but then a whole bunch of other things, because remember that cardiovascular and cancer together only account for about half of deaths. And we see that there's other important things going on for other causes of death that we're yet to dig into in great detail. We're about to do that. And this was true in the Blacks as well. So at the national level, making a comparison like this and adjusting, and this is in non-smokers, remember, same study actually, and adjusting for education and region of residence, this is what we're seeing. So something important is going on here. So looking within the Adventist group now, and remember that means our reference group, the orange, are a pretty healthy group. They're not big meat eaters, but here is our reference group, and we see that the vegetarians in general are doing better. Not dramatically, but importantly and significantly. A paper that we still is under review, it's not yet published, and keep that in mind, is looks like it's going to be pretty interesting and perhaps a little controversial, where we've looked at not so much what you eat in terms of food groups and so forth, but whether or not the food is highly processed or not. And without going into a lot of detail here, just to give you some idea, we had about 45 different food groups. And so there are minimally processed foods, fresh fruits, and highly processed jams and pies and things like this. And we can divide each of these categories into high processed and low processed examples. Let's focus just because of time on those highlighted in yellow here. And this is comparing in all subjects, Adventist subjects, high versus low processed diets, diets that have more as compared to less of these processed foods across the board of all these dietary categories. And you can see that those that prefer highly processed foods are having about a 25% increase in risk, 24%, and this is risk of total mortality. If we look only now within the vegetarians, the blues, we find the same thing. And that's interesting, isn't it? So it shows that even within the vegetarian group, there are vegetarians who are eating much better than others. And this focuses to some extent on the level of processing in foods. And then here are the non-vegetarians, and again, roughly the same type of result. So this is an interesting addition to what we know about vegetarian and non-vegetarian diets. So one question comes, could these extra years be good years? And so it's interesting for us to compare the likelihood of, let's say, feeling good, quality of life, in an average Adventist as compared to an average non-Adventist as people are aging. I'm just going to give you data here for men because of time, but I can tell you the graphs in women look almost identical. And this is using a well-known scale, the SF scale. And these are the US norms on the scale for quality of mental health, perceived mental health at different ages, as you can see down here. And things tend to fall off a little bit at the oldest age, as you might imagine. And here are the Black and white Adventist data. So at least up to even beyond 74 years of age, the Adventists, there's not only more of them that are surviving up to here, they are having a better quality, better experience of mental health in these extra years. If we look now at physical health, and again, this is men, but very similar in women, And you can see the black is the US norms, and no surprise, physical health overall deteriorates as a person gets older here. But again, notice that the Adventists are doing better in terms of their perceived physical health on this scale. That's probably no surprise, because some of the disorders we've talked about, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and so forth, are diseases that impact quality of life. I'd like to turn now, as we're coming towards the end, to the biology of veganism, particularly as compared to non-vegetarians. And this is more pilot work, just to give you a little sense of things. Here we're looking at what we call DNA methylation, which is one of the ways of genetic control, and are genes expressed or not. And as many of you know, that a lesser methylation of a gene often implies less suppression of that gene. Methylation tends to suppress the gene's function. And so if it's less methylated, there'll be less suppression of that. And we've looked at a large number of what we call CPG sites where the DNA can become methylated or not. And taking account of what we call false discovery, because this is a particular kind of high dimensional analysis, statistical analysis, we were able to find a number of sites that were different between the vegans and the non-vegetarian Adventists in their DNA methylation. And these genes that we could detect in a relatively small sample were often involved in things like RNA transport, ribosome assembly, as protein degradation and ubiquitination, and beta cell receptor signaling, a lot of these being involved with protein synthesis. We're also looking at metabolomics, and we have data on 930 plasma metabolites. Again, comparing vegans and non-vegetarians, taking account of false discovery from the multiple testing. And we found that even doing that about 500 were significantly different between the vegans and the non-vegetarians. Often these representing lipids, amino acids, and xenobiotics. It indicates, I think one can say, that the fluids that bathe the cells of vegans are rather different to those that are surrounding the cells of non-vegetarians. And presumably this has got some biological signal. So what can you believe, in my opinion? And we all know that nutritional epidemiology is a very difficult science. There are many traps for the unwary. And I don't have time to go into this, but we have done our best to negotiate around these potential traps. For instance, in the selection of our population with a very wide range of exposure that helps with statistical power, vegetarians and non-vegetarians. I haven't focused on it, but we have done regression calibration, correction for measurement error of the diet. We're dealing with missing data. We only have small amounts, but nevertheless, when you've got many variables in a model, that can have an impact. We use multiple imputation. We're being very careful about covariate adjustment, adjusting for many other things that can confuse the results, excuse me, if they're correlated with the dietary factor that's of interest. Which you can see we're getting to look at biological mechanisms to try and explain some of these correlations that we find. Obviously, we check the consistency of our data with other high quality studies and ask questions, does it tell an internally consistent story, looking at the population as a whole, then looking at the dietary patterns, then looking at particular foods, and then starting to look at metabolites and so forth. So the bottom line from our studies, here's what I think. It seems to me that at the top here, I've talked about a foundation. It seems a fair foundation is to prefer or trend towards plant-based diets. And this can include things like a wide variety of vegetables, fruits, and nuts and legumes. Nuts particularly seem to be important. Dairy might be important, but in complicated ways with respect to cancer, and also particularly red meats. And second, and related to this, we have some evidence to be careful with too many of the highly processed foods. Putting all this into place, we can expect better heart health and impact on better risks of cancer and diabetes and high blood pressure and longevity, less overweight, particularly if you eat most of your calories before the evening, remember, and that long gap through to breakfast. And thinking about specific foods, we seem to find that nuts are protective, particularly against cardiovascular disease, probably fiber as well. Red meats increase the risk of heart disease and probably bowel cancer. Dairy may increase the risk of prostate and breast cancers. That's a story that's unfolding, and probably decreases the risk of colorectal cancer. So finally, continue to follow the preponderance of evidence from high quality studies. But remember, if we wait to act till all is crystal clear, that's suboptimal. Why? Because by that time, we'll all be dead, and probably at younger ages than necessary. Thank you.
When it comes to your health, it's okay to go a little nuts, especially since heart disease is so prevalent in our country.
In fact, 1/3 of Americans have high LDL cholesterol, the bad kind of cholesterol. Those with high total cholesterol have twice the risk of heart disease compared to people whose cholesterol levels are under 200.
With heart disease being the #1 killer in the United States, researchers advise us to go nuts with our health.
Back in 1993, Loma Linda University Health made a landmark discovery that reversed the health advice from the American Heart Association. Up until then, the organization advised the public against eating nuts because of the high fat content.
However, Dr. Joan Sabate discovered that adding 1 to 2 servings of nuts to our daily diets could actually cut our risk of having a heart attack in half. During the initial study, the researchers put subjects on a 2-month diet known as the American Heart Association Step 1 diet to lower cholesterol.
Half of those subjects were fed the same diet with 20% of the calories coming from walnuts. The following month, the groups switched.
The walnut diet lowered much more the cholesterol, particularly the LDL cholesterol that is considered the bad cholesterol, without changes in the good cholesterol, the HDL cholesterol.
Nuts are rich in unsaturated fat, a healthy type of fat that our bodies need to reduce LDLs, the bad cholesterol in our blood. In addition, walnuts have high levels of omega-3 fatty acids. Omega-3s help lower levels of triglycerides, a type of fat in the bloodstream. But nuts are also loaded with protein.
Percent-wise and quantity-wise is even greater than the protein that is in meat or in many other animal products. Besides fat and protein, nuts have many other micronutrients, such as minerals, vitamins.
For more than 20 years, Dr. Sabate has been studying the effect of nuts on our health and summarized that 1 to 2 servings of nuts a day lowers cholesterol by 10%.
So, what are today's health tips? Eat a handful of nuts a day to cut your risk of heart disease in half and reduce your cholesterol.
Every morning that I have a smoothie, I put whatever is the ripe fruit that is available, and then 2 or 3 handfuls of nuts, and that is a perfect smoothie.
Other ways to incorporate nuts into your diet include topping salads with nuts instead of croutons, or adding them on pizza and pasta. There is your tip for the day on how you can live healthier longer.
Good evening. It is a pleasure for me to be a participant in this convention organized by the Christian Medical College in Baylor. My name is Joan Sabate, and I'm a professor of nutrition and epidemiology at the School of Public Health in Loma Linda University, California. I came to India 44 years ago when I finished medical school. I'm originally from Barcelona, Spain, and is where I study medicine. And I was eager to visit India. And I really admire, the people and the country. I always wanted to come back, but I never did. But I hope that this way to present is in a way for me to reconnect with the persons in India. I'm going to present today about some of my research that I conducted at Loma Linda University. And in the context of the food and also the conference, I entitled my presentation, Not Intake, a lifestyle approach to prevent cardiometabolic diseases. What is a nut? I'm holding here a walnut after I finished my first study with nuts, as particularly walnuts. Nuts are divided into ground nuts, such as peanuts, and tree nuts, such as walnuts, almonds, hazelnuts, macadamia, so on and so forth. They are common foods in many cultures and diets and are intrinsic now to many dietary guidelines. And there is a growing interest in consumption and visibility of nuts. They are concentrated sources of energy, excellent sources of protein and fat, and many sources of minerals, vitamins, and many phytochemicals. The connection between nuts and health started at Loma Linda when we made an epidemiological study on the Adventist health studies. And we found that there was a direct connection with the prevention of cardiovascular disease. Later on, many more studies, and here I'm going to present the American ones, that connected nuts with lower risk of cardiovascular disease. Our first study was published in Archives of Internal Medicine in 1992. It was the first epidemiological study. And here we have those that participants in the cohort that consume nuts very frequently had roughly half the risk of developing a myocardial infarction or having a fatal coronary heart disease. 8 years later, the Nurses' Health Study from Harvard presented very similar results, and they found a protection for both non-fatal as well as fatal coronary heart disease. So the 4 American studies that have looked at and they found results, you see that all go in the same direction. No systematic review of the literature is needed to really see that eating nuts frequently is accompanied by a lowering of the risk of heart disease. We did a very simple summary of this, and we found that across the studies, an 8% reduction on CVD risk was observed for each weekly serving of nuts. So whatever is the intake of nuts, 1 serving a week increase is associated with a lower risk by 8% of coronary heart disease. Nuts also lower the risk of heart disease through the mechanisms of the serum lipids. And that's what we were set to propose, and we're able to conduct many studies on that. I'm going to present a couple of studies that we did at Loma Linda. But before, let me say that over 100 human studies have evaluated the effects of nut-containing diets and serum lipids and lipoproteins after our first publication in 1993 in the New England Journal of Medicine, the effects of walnuts on serum lipid levels and blood pressure in normal men. The purpose of our study was to see what happened when part of the step 1 diet, a cholesterol-lowering diet, energy was replaced with walnuts. We did a crossover design in which all subjects were randomized to both diets, but in different order, where only 18 young medical students. And we found that the step 1 diet, lower cholesterol compared with the baseline, but the walnut diet much more. And the same happened with triglycerides. We subsequently did many studies, but I'm just going to present another one. And also in the idea of causality, because we wanted to see if there was a dose-response relationship. And we found that replacing either 10% or 20% of the energy with almonds from the step 1 diet, we found that there was a progressive decrease in total cholesterol, a progressive decrease in LDL cholesterol, not much changes in HDL, and an increase in ApoA and a decrease in ApoB. All of these changes are compatible with the prevention of cardiovascular disease. This is a comic that was published in an Australian journal when we published these results. And, you know, the monkey is telling to the other monkey, I mean, better eat the nuts if you don't want to have high cholesterol like your dad. So, nuts composition is unique. Is a combination of nutrients that all together, I mean, have biological activity. They are high in fat, but besides fat, they also have plant protein, dietary fiber, vitamins and minerals, phytochemicals, and all of these nutrients seems to be protecting the heart. What are the established mechanisms of action that nuts may improve serum lipids? Many clinical trials have shown that all nuts, regardless if they are ground nuts or tree nuts, lower total cholesterol, the LDL cholesterol, the ratio of LDL to HDL, and also triglycerides. In addition, there are other mechanisms for which we have not so much evidence because there are not so many studies done, but seems to prevent the oxidizability of LDL. They raise the levels of vitamin E in the blood. They lower the CRP protein and also improve the endothelial function. I'm going to present a clinical trial, a randomized clinical trial for the primary prevention of coronary heart disease by the intake of nuts. This is what it has been denominated the PREDIMED trial. Prevention with a Mediterranean diet. This study had 3 arms, and subjects with risk factors were allocated to either the same diet but lower fat, so it's called a low fat diet, or a diet enriched with a mix of nuts, or a diet that had extra virgin olive oil. There were 7,000 subjects that were followed for more than 5 years, and I had the privilege to be in the data management and safety board of this study. This was a primary prevention conducted in Spain, a multi-center trial. And I'm going to present results on the primary endpoint and also a little bit on the secondary endpoints. The primary endpoints were cardiovascular death, myocardial infarction, or stroke. And here we have, what are the findings of this study? At 3 months of just starting the study, remember that was a 5 years study, we already found that subjects either on the olive oil diet or the Mediterranean diet or the nuts diet, they both lower systolic and diastolic blood pressure. However, on the control diet, that is the normal treatment, there was no change. On these thousands of subjects in pre-living conditions, not entirely metabolic conditions as we did in the previous studies, it was found that indeed both the extra virgin olive oil and the nuts lower total cholesterol and LDL cholesterol, slightly raise HDL, and lower triglycerides. Besides the risk factors, what happened to the primary outcomes, the heart outcomes? So this is the publication on the primary prevention of cardiovascular disease with the Mediterranean diet. We found here that the accumulated incidence of cardiovascular disease events. It progressed up as far as the years pass. However, immediately from the first year, there was a dissociation between the control group in black versus the not groups in brown, together with the olive oil group. So at the end of the 5 years, there was a hazard ratio of 0.7. That means a 30% reduction in the risk of coronary heart disease on the nut diet, on the nut supplemented diet, and as well as in the extra virgin olive oil. What happened as far as the diabetic incidence? Very similar, although not so clear results for nuts. We found that the accumulated diabetes incidence over the years, it was lower for extra virgin olive oil, and also lower, but not so much compared with the control group for nuts. So we have now, I would say, quite a strong evidence in a randomized clinical trial on primary prevention as far as both diabetes and coronary heart disease. So what can we conclude? The frequency of nut consumption has been found to be protective against coronary heart disease in many epidemiological studies, not only in America, but in Europe and in Asia. But also in a primary prevention in a large randomized clinical trial. Across the studies, we can compute that there is an 8% reduction in the risk of coronary heart disease for each weekly serving of nuts. So as we increase on a weekly basis a serving of nut, the risk of cardiovascular disease gets decreased by about 8%. Diets containing nuts improve serum lipids, lipoproteins in men and women with normal as well as an elevated cholesterol. So my closing thought is that daily intake of a small quantity of nuts is one of the most acceptable lifestyle interventions for the prevention of coronary heart disease. So instead of taking away foods, we can incorporate a food that prevents for cardiovascular disease. So practical applications, people regularly shop for foods rather than nutrients, and nuts can fit any diet pattern or lifestyle. Practical, a serving of nuts is considered 32 peanuts, if we want to count, about 20 almonds or hazelnuts, or 7 whole walnuts or 14 halves. I appreciate your interest, and here is my email in case you want to contact. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hello, my name is Dr. Olivia Moses, and I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk about corporate wellness programs. I am the Executive Director of Corporate Health and Wellness here at Loma Linda University Health, and I'm also the Director of the Wholeness Institute here at our organization. I'm excited about this topic because I've been doing this for 15 years here at Loma Linda, and I love talking about corporate health and wellness because it gives us an opportunity to discuss the health of our workforces and the opportunities we have to actually impact lives. So when we look at this presentation today, I have ordered it as such. What is corporate wellness? Why do we need corporate wellness programs? What is Loma Linda University doing in this realm? How do corporate wellness programs benefit our organization? So when we look at the definition of what actually is corporate wellness, well, it is any program designed to encourage healthy lifestyles amongst the workforce. So you see this on a spectrum. Many organizations have corporate wellness programs, but they can be as simple as doing simple vaccines and immunizations to all the way on the other side of the spectrum to be more comprehensive, to even address weight management and diabetes and heart disease. So it depends on where you fall into this on what we call corporate wellness, but it's all in the same realm. Now, when we look at the world, Who actually offers corporate wellness programming? Well, we see only 10% of the world's workers have access to workplace wellness programs and services. What we see here is that usually it's North America and Europe that we talk about when it comes to corporate wellness, but the importance of these types of programs is being seen globally, and we're seeing the numbers increase. And that's for actually a number of reasons. So some of the variety of reasons is we know that we have 3.2 billion workers worldwide, and they are increasingly unwell. What we're seeing is that there are a lot of workforces out there that work full-time, more than full-time, 7 days a week sometimes, and still don't make enough to meet the needs of themselves and their family. So we see here that 74% live on less than $13 a day, and 45% work in low skill or manual occupations. So especially in that manual labor category, we see a lot of injuries and a lot of things that we could help prevent. So we're seeing people who have shorter work life because of the injury that they have. And then we're also seeing, how do we care for them? We are also seeing an older population. As the lifespan of all of us kind of increases, we are also seeing that we are dealing with a lot of other chronic illnesses. So basically, we're growing older and less healthy. 18% of the globe, when we look at our labor force, by 2030 is going to be over 55. 52% of adults are overweight and obese, and you can see the statistics here with diabetes and those suffering from physical well-being issues. And also we know that we are being stressed out. So basically we are stressed, unhappy, and even unsafe at work. And you see here that 38% suffer from really excessive pressure on the job. So we're dealing with a lot of health opportunities here to actually improve health. So why are corporate wellness programs important, and why are they really a must if you want your business to succeed? Well, studies show that employees are more likely to be on the job, so meaning they're showing up and they are staying there, meaning we have less sick days. And not only are they showing up and being there for longer amounts of time, they are actually performing better. They have improved disease management and prevention. They increase employee retention and job satisfaction. And, you know, a lot of times when we think about corporate wellness, we really focus on the health piece of it, which is really important. However, we don't always recognize what a great recruiting mechanism employee work wellness programs are. So not only do you have this reputation, let's say if you have a great wellness program that you take care of employees, you then start getting better candidates for your job position because they know that this employer takes care of them. You also see, not only do you get better candidates for your work, you actually have your employees stay for longer because they feel well taken care of. So you increase employee retention and job satisfaction, you have a better running business, and of course, ultimately you save money. So let's talk about absenteeism. So here, when you have a person with simple infectious diseases like a cold or flu and they call off because they can't come in. You also see this when they have sick kids as well. But then you get into the more serious or more chronic issues such as diabetes and heart issues and the complications to obesity and so on and so forth. You see bigger and bigger spans when it comes to people off of work. Here in the United States, absenteeism due to poor health can cost your company about $3,600 per year for each hourly employee and about almost $2,700 a year for salaried employees. And for big organizations, that can add up very, very quickly. Not only are you kind of losing money, you're also losing product because you don't have employees there to actually further your mission and your values of the organization. So here at Loma Linda, we actually have a wonderful wellness program, I'm proud to say. It is called Living Whole. And we have a number of different programs. So as I mentioned, I have been doing this for 15 years here at Loma Linda. We established a corporate wellness program here in 2006. These are some of the fundamental things we decided before we actually started the program. Number one, we wanted to have a comprehensive approach. We wanted to address the whole person. So we didn't only want to address physical health. We wanted to address the mental health, the spiritual health of the employee as well. We wanted to do it because it fostered employee relations. We wanted employees to feel like Loma Linda cares for them and values them. Employees do not receive payment for their participation. When I started this 15 years ago, there was a huge interest in corporate wellness here in the United States. And what employers were doing was actually paying employees to participate in their wellness program. We decided not to pay employees to do this because we wanted to foster an environment where the biggest beneficiary of good health is actually the employee themselves. Also, it is helpful when resources are actually limited. We wanted to avoid duplicating existing services. So if you have organizational programs, partner with them because you don't need to redo or recreate the wheel. Use data for research and program improvement. We wanted to be data-driven and evidence-based. We wanted to measure the impact of these interventions, and also we wanted to influence the corporate culture. We wanted to change the culture of Loma Linda, that people would actually start focusing on their health and realize health is an important aspect of everyone's life, and that your employer supports you in emphasizing it in yours. Now, this is a large list of the programs that we offer. We offer everything from weight management programs to smoking cessation programs to diabetes treatment programs. We have behavior change programs. We have walking programs. We actually have a fairly comprehensive program here at Loma Linda. However, not all companies focus and really dedicate budget dollars for this. And wellness does not have to break the bank. So when you're getting started, or if you're interested and you're getting started, start off small and grow. And that's what we had to do here at Loma Linda. Because resources are limited, and they're usually always limited when it comes to wellness and prevention, what we did is we started off small. We started off with a segment of our population, and then we established and piloted our programs. We improved them, and then we started moving across the organization. And I'm happy to say now we have programs that are actually organization-wide. Now, one of the things is corporate culture. It is very important for your leaders to understand that wellness is a priority and that they promote it themselves. This is Dr. Ron Carter. He is the provost of our university. He's having a standing meeting. When you have leaders do these kinds of things, employees actually get wind of this and hear this, and then start saying, well, if they can do it, so can we. And they actually start seeing what they can do, and the tone of the organization actually changes. Here at Loma Linda, another thing that we did is we have an entire hallway in our vintage building, or our old hospital, that actually is dedicated to wellness. And what we did is we had leaders, this is Dr. Hart, the president of our organization, here in his home, and what he does to stay well. And one of the things is he is a very big outdoors person. He raises animals, has an orchard, and he actually chops wood every winter to use during the winter time. So we wanted employees to actually see their leaders living wholeness and wellness in their own life. And that is really important if you are a leader, for you to exemplify wellness to your employees. So what I wanted to look at is, what is India dealing with when it comes to their employee health or their workforce health? And what I found is a survey that was done with over 400 human resources professionals in India, over 15 different industries. And what they found was that 40% of organizations have a documented well-being plan in place. So this is taking off, and I love seeing this amongst our international brothers and sisters. And that 50% of organizations offer such health benefits as screenings and health awareness programs, which is excellent. However, 50%, we really need to bump that up. So if you don't have one, now's the time to start thinking of one, because competitive workforces in India are actually focusing on this. 56% report that well-being programs help improve employee performance and a company's bottom line. So if you are at an organization where the resources are really strict and really small, it is important for leadership to know that your wellness program can improve your bottom line. Now, it's very interesting, and what you are seeing in India is what we're seeing here in the US, with organizations viewing well-being as part of employee engagement. It does seem ironic that 65% of organizations have trouble engaging their employees in well-being programs, and that's here in the United States. When your wellness program is new, everyone is like, oh, interesting, let me hear about it. When you have been in it for a few years, it starts to get old. And what you have to do is rebrand yourself, use different strategies, use different modes of communication and recruitment to your programs. Now, with the onset of COVID, what we have seen in the US as well is that our old problems didn't go away. What we are doing is actually building on top of our old problems, and that we are seeing more and more employees being stressed out at work. And what are they actually being stressed out about? Self and family physical health, of course, especially with COVID. Work tasks and deadlines you see here, self and family mental health is a growing issue across the globe that is being recognized. Performance appraisals in this high intensity work where sometimes our workforces are dwindling, meaning people aren't at work, people are low staff, so there's more of a burden on the work for the people who are actually healthy. What is happening when it comes to the demand on them, and they're worried about how they're performing and how their bosses are seeing them perform. Social distancing and isolation, relationship issues, being laid off, what are they going to do if their source of their money, and a lot of times they are the sole income in their family. What happens if they get laid off? And then of course, children's education, which is always an issue. So what should you do if you are interested in organizing a program at your institution? Well, the first thing is, and I assume you're going to start with limited resources just like I did, because most people do. When you have limited resources, it is extremely important to carefully prioritize and plan your program. All the time this happens in the industry where people say, I know what the people need, and they'll go do it without really much planning, without asking the employees what they want or if they will participate, and or not getting their leadership approval and or participation and their support. So you have to think about these things and think them through. And we also always want to encourage individuals and to promote and to harness their excitement about it, but planning is important. That planning phase of things can make or break your programs. So here in the US, we actually have an organization called the Wellness Councils of America, and I want to share with you their 7 benchmarks that they have when it comes to how to create a wellness program. So number 1, we need to be committed and aligned with leadership. So when we go in with a wellness program idea, we have to get the ideas and the needs of leadership and align them with the mission and values of the organization. We want to collaborate in support of wellness with other employees and departments that you are involved with. Sometimes you might have an organization that is working on health and wellness outside your organization, and it's important to see if you can actually partner with them as well. Collect data, so meaningful data to prove your case. It is always great when you actually identify a need and say this employee wellness program fulfills that need of the employee. Craft an operating plan, which includes objectives, what outcomes you are expected to see, and the timeline you are expected to see them. And a lot of times when it comes to corporate wellness, you don't see things in 1 or 2 weeks or 3 months. Sometimes it takes 1 to 3 years to see some of the benefits that you are of all the work that you're doing. So be honest with leadership and make sure that they know that this is a long-term commitment of their organization. Choose initiatives that support the whole employee, cultivate supportive health promoting environments, policies, and practices. This is extremely important when it comes to how the organization runs. So it's not, this is how we run the organization and this is the wellness program, and hopefully those two meet somewhere. It actually has to all work together. And also, obviously, always, always, always evaluate, evaluate, evaluate. Because if you want to have a long-term program, you have to keep justifying your program. So you always want to evaluate, you want to communicate your outcomes to your leadership, and always celebrate. When you have some wins and you have some successes, celebrate those wins, make leadership know about them, and really celebrate the employees that are doing the hard work of improving their lives, and iterate, iterate, iterate. You always want to repeat, repeat, repeat the story that you are having. I will say, in the years that I've been doing this, I have enjoyed every step of the process. Now, I'm not here to say that it is easy or simple. It is definitely a process, but it is some of the most rewarding work that I have ever done. When you see your workforce, when you see employees change their lives, when you see leadership happy about how employees are coming to work, how they're staying at work, how they are happy and productive at work, it is some of the most rewarding work that I have ever done. So if you want to know more about corporate wellness programs, feel free to visit us here at Loma Linda, or you can email me. My email is omoses@llu.edu. That's omoses@llu.edu. Thank you so much for your time today, and blessings to you as you move forward in your own health and potentially in corporate wellness.
Thank you for joining us as we celebrate the ribbon cutting for the Dennis and Carol Troche Medical Campus. This is truly a historic day in the legacy of Loma Linda University Health.
The acts of healing soon to be taking place in these walls will give our patients hope during the most stressful moments of their lives.
Thank you, Dr. Hart, for being the beacon of hope, not only for this hospital, but for the community for so many years.
The Dennis and Carol Troche Medical Campus is named after two people who believed with us from the very beginning.
We are now ready to signify the opening by cutting the ribbon to these towers.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you ready for the historic ribbon cutting?
This is so exciting. I can't hardly contain myself.
The effort and sacrifice you have all put into preparing for today have not gone unnoticed.
And I thank each of you from the bottom of my heart.
What an incredible day it is. It's not just moving of patients, it's moving of hearts. This is indeed a moment that many of us have been waiting for many years. And to watch it come to fruition, see the accomplishments of the new building, and watch mankind move, the transition of care into the newest technology we have. It's such a moving experience. So it's a delight to be here and be part of this event.
It's nice to finally have him here. It feels amazing. We have history now.
Today has been a marvelous experience. I moved from the darkness into the light, coming into this room that I can not only see the sun, but the hills, and it's been a great day.
Awesome.